Welcome to the KO Boxing Show. Haven't we got a big show tonight? The First Lady of Boxing, Jackie Kallen. Thank you, all the way from Detroit. Thank you for being on the KO Boxing Show.
It's my pleasure. It's a little late over there. It's earlier here, early morning here, late night there.
Yeah, good for you, good for you. You've always been involved in showbiz, and let's go over some of the biggest names you've interviewed. You start off as a journalist. You interviewed Frank Sinatra, Elvis Presley, and the Rolling Stones. What was it like interviewing such legends of the entertainment industry?
I've been doing it a very long time, Peter, so I've had the opportunity to meet most of the most iconic people in the last half of the last century, and that includes Michael Jackson and a lot of sports figures like Magic Johnson and, some exciting politicians, people like, of course, Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, Ronald Reagan. I've had the opportunity to meet the biggest people in every walk of life. And I think the takeaway from that is that basically we're all the same. We have a different job, we have a different career path, but most of the people I've met were very easy to talk to. And when you got down to the real stuff that didn't include their career choice, then we could talk about things that everybody would talk about. So that was kind of my forte as a journalist, to talk about the things that weren't the typical that everybody else was asking, like, how did you get in this business? Or how did it feel to win your Oscar? It was more like, tell me about your family. Tell me about your kids. What do you do in your spare time? Things that made these iconic, legendary people more relatable. And so that was my way of communicating, and it seemed to work really well.
When I mention Elvis Presley, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? What was it like to interview Elvis? What was he like as a person? Was he really 6 foot? A lot of people say he was just on 6 foot.
No, he was. And of course, the time that I met him was near the end of his life. I would have loved to have met the early Elvis, but the Elvis that I met was a little overweight, seemed to be under the influence of some sort of medications. His eyes were kind of at half mast. And at the concert that night, he forgot some of the lyrics to some of the songs. So I think I actually ended up meeting him at the worst time of his life rather than the best time. And it was before he was set to go on stage for the show. And I remember leaning over to him and saying, wouldn't it be nice if we could just get in your car and drive away and just do something fun and normal? And he said, I wish.
Yeah. Well, that's how it gets at the end, doesn't it? It's work. Frank Sinatra, what was Frank Sinatra like?
Oh, he was one of my favorites because he was one of my mother's favorites, and I grew up with his music. And he was part of the Rat Pack, which over here in the United States was a very popular group of entertainers who performed mostly in Vegas. And they were like the cool guys, the ones that got all the girls that stayed up late drinking and gambling and carousing. And so meeting him, he was called the chairman of the board, or Old Blue Eyes. And the first time I met him, I kind of tricked him into the interview because I knew he was going to be in town for a couple of nights. So I knew one of the stagehands where he was playing, and I'd written just a glorious, brilliant article about how wonderful he was. So I made sure that they taped it onto his mirror with a note saying, I would love to meet you. And so they came and got me the next night and brought me back to meet him. He was very, very flattered by the article. And then, of course, I met him a few times after that at fights. He was a big fight fan. But being in his presence, he was a small man. He wasn't like a tall, Elvis was much bigger than him. But his presence, Peter, you walked in the room with Frank Sinatra and he owned that room. And in order to get his attention, you had to be a very confident, outgoing person who walked right up to him and acted like you were his equal, because you could tell he was a type that could squash you if you were shy or in awe of him. So you had to kind of match his attitude to get his attention. But he was great. He was Frank Sinatra. I mean, what can you say? A legend.
Yeah, see, some great memories. Then you went into boxing. Thomas Hitman Hearns, you were his publicist. What was it like working with someone like Tommy Hearns?
Well, it's interesting because I had been an entertainment writer for for many years at a daily paper. And in the mid 70s, they were short a sports writer, and they sent me on an assignment. And I did well. And they said, "Would you like to do sports as well as cover entertainment?" And I said, "Sure, I'd love to." I come from a family with only a brother. My father was one of three, and my husband was one of four. And then I had two sons. So I was really surrounded daily and, constantly with this testosterone. So sports and fast cars and gambling, that's all I knew. So I said, "Yeah, I can do this." And at that time, there were very, very few women in the country going into locker rooms and covering sports. So it was a bit of an anomaly. And at first, I was not greeted the most graciously, as you can imagine, but I kind of wormed my way into their hearts. And one of my earlier interviews was with Tommy Hearns, a young fighter, just turned pro, still fighting 4 rounds. I'd never been to a live boxing match. To me, it was just an assignment. But I was so fascinated, number one, by the sport, the whole idea of, one man against another. And I was very intrigued by the fact that when they got in the ropes, they became animals. They just wanted to tear each other's head off. But then when they came back out of the ropes, they were congratulating each other, hugging. And I was very curious how you turn that switch on and off. How did these people train their minds to go into kill mode and then switch it off and hug? So I was intrigued by the sport. And Emmanuel Stewart, who was the trainer manager of Tommy Hearns, hired me to be their publicist. And it was fascinating. We went all over the world with all the Kronk fighters, fights in Hong Kong and fights in Paris and every place you can imagine, mostly in Vegas and a lot here in Detroit. And I studied the sport. I really studied the ins and outs of it. I had Emmanuel teach me how to wrap hands, how to stop cuts, how to pick the right opponents. And I did that for 10 years before I really decided to go out and try managing. I wanted a complete education of every aspect of the sport. I did not want to try something that I thought I would fail at. So I made sure that I really knew everything about my sport.
Gee, Emmanuel Stewart doesn't get a better mentor than someone like that. What a great man and what a great loss. You're also a consultant for Mark Burnett for the TV show Contender. What was it like being involved in a Contender?
That was a highlight, I would say, of my career because I've always loved Sylvester Stallone and Sugar Ray Leonard, and I knew them both prior to the show. So it was kind of like getting together with friends. And we had the same dressing room every day, the three of us. So for 2 months, we were together all the time. And the stories that were told were just incredible. And then, of course, shooting with these young fighters, 16 to start with, there's 14 still living today. And I stay in touch with, I'd say, about half of the cast. And it's been about 15 years. And they were just great guys. And everybody was so excited to be part of this new show. And I can't say enough about Sylvester Stallone. He is an amazing guy. I mean, he comes off as kind of, yo, Adrian, that kind of a guy, but he's brilliant. He's a writer, he's a producer, he's a director, he's a father and a husband and a friend. And, he's probably one of the most interesting men that I've ever worked with or met.
Wow. It must have been a great experience for you during that time. And it produced also a lot of good fighters. There's an Australian in there, Sam Solomon and Sakio Bika. I don't know if you were involved with them at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Or,
no, but I know certainly who they are, of course.
Yeah. Also, you went on to manage James Toney, and he's an interesting character. Just the way he is, cigar smoking, brash, moved up from middleweight, went right up to heavyweight. Seems like a guy that breaks all the rules and gets away with it. What was it like being involved with James Toney? Because you set up the fight with Michael Nunn, and it was a huge upset too.
Well, I was managing a heavyweight named Bobby Hitz out of Chicago. He's my first fighter that actually said, "I'm going to give this woman a chance," because I think a lot of fighters felt embarrassed having a woman as their manager. It wasn't at all common at that time. I don't think there was another one in sight. So he was the first to give me the chance. And when we were actually in the gym, the other fighters were kind of paying attention, like, who is this woman that's here? And James Toney had just lost his manager. He had been killed. And I took a look at this kid, and he was angry. I mean, if he had a bad day sparring, he'd kick the spit bucket, he'd pound the lockers. He was very hard on himself, and I liked that. I knew that he was really dedicated to being the best he could be. And we got talking one day, and he had been dabbling a little bit with selling drugs on the side, and he was just a street kid, 19. And I said, I think we could work well together, because I just knew I could handle his temperament. And fortunately for me, it was a good combination. We spent 6 years together building his career and getting 2 titles. And I have to say that the Nunn fight, it was a gutsy move on my part, because everybody advised me not to take that fight. He was 20-1 underdog.
Yeah.
We fought him in his backyard with 30,000 of his fans and maybe 30 people from Detroit that made the trip there. We were totally outnumbered. And I had my serious doubts whether I was wrong going into the fight. And all the way up to about the 7th, 8th round, I thought, maybe this wasn't the right time. But then out came that left hook in the 11th round, changed history.
Yeah. And you also managed Branco McKart, who was a WBO world champion. So you've had success with boxing. What's happening now?
Oh, I just want to add that I've also worked with Pinklin Thomas, who was heavyweight champion briefly, Tom Boom Boom Johnson, who is featherweight champion, and several fighters that have had regional and U.S. titles. So I'm pretty used to the title game, and a lot of my fighters have fought for titles. So I really like working with fighters at the top level like that. I think that there are many, many managers, and they're certainly a godsend. We need them, who may have a stable of opponents, fighters with 6-6 records or 10-6 records. And we use those fighters to build our fighters' records. So I personally prefer to work with someone who I believe has the ability to be a world champion. And so my fighters are a little bit more on the elite side. And so I usually only work with someone who I think can be a top 10 contender or go all the way to a world title. So Branco is an example of that. Branco came out of the National Golden Gloves, and he didn't win it. But I loved his performance, and I loved his dedication to the sport. And he's a great, great guy. He's still one of my best friends. I see Branco all the time. Branco and Tommy I see, because we all live near each other, all the time. He's on the boxing commission now here in Michigan.
Wow,
and
that's great.
He's an amazing young man. I say young man, he's a grandfather now, but to me, they're all young men. I've been doing this 42 years, so they're all young men to me.
Who are the promoters that you enjoyed working with throughout the journey? Who did you find
I would have to say at that time, Bob Arum, more so than Don King. Those were the 2 major promoters. And I worked with Arum. I did some work with Don King, but I think that I was more comfortable with Bob Arum because there were no racial overtones. And he was not, I'm not saying that Don King was sexist necessarily, but I think he was more comfortable dealing with men, whereas Bob Arum was very open to me. And the negotiations were very smooth and easy, and we always walked away with both of us being happy. And I think Don King's personality, he likes to win. So he likes to feel like, maybe he got over on you a little bit. So I found negotiating in his ballpark a little tougher, but Bob Arum was the sweetheart, and he was wonderful. He got my guys belts, and he was a pleasure to work with.
Who are the boxers that you're working with now? You're still interested in boxing as far as getting a young fighter, and because it's mentioned that were you working with any Filipino boxers at any stage?
I didn't hear that.
Were you working with any Filipino boxers? Did you?
Oh, I was. Yes, I was. I had 2 Filipino brothers, the Donaire brothers. And Nonito Donaire was very successful. His brother retired, not as successful as Nonito, but they were really nice young men. Their father trained them, and they were polite. They were hardworking. I've had mostly, for the most part, wonderful fighters, personality-wise as well as talent-wise. James was a little tough at times, personality-wise, because he had a temper, and he loved to cause trouble. It was, now he's, a grown man. He's a grandfather also, so we all mellow. But back in the day when he was in his early 20s, he would smash through a glass window if he was mad. He would take the scale and throw it through the wall if he didn't like the number. And yeah, he was a handful, but it was worth it because he was a terrific fighter. Probably, I'd say, one of the best defensive fighters that I've ever worked with. You couldn't get away from that shoulder roll and the way he picked off punches. Very fast, very slick. He was a pleasure to watch. I think every young fighter should watch tapes of James Toney because I think they'd learn a lot from him.
I fully agree. What would be before we sign off the interview, what would be one of your funniest boxing stories? Obviously, as a manager, you'd have a million, but what was the one where you thought?
Well, I'm going to give you a couple, but I do want to mention the fighter that I'm working with right now because we sort of touched on that and didn't get to name him. But my main prospect now is named Mike Williams, and he's a 140-pounder. He's 16-0-1, should be 17-0. That was a strange one. But at any rate, he's a young fighter, 22, very promising. He's signed with Lou DiBella, who is a promoter here in New York, in the United States. Unfortunately, we got stopped by the virus. So there's not a lot of activity. I don't know how it is over there. Are you doing fights over there?
No, we're in lockdown here as well. We're pretty strict lockdown. So
yeah,
5K zones and stuff.
So he hasn't fought since last November. It's going on a year. So it really put a halt to his momentum. But I think that when he picks up again, he's going to be a future champion. He's excellent. Lots of speed, a lot of determination. I think he's a real good prospect. As to the moments, I mean, it's pretty hard to top the Nunn win because that was so unexpected. And here we have this white woman manager who nobody really knew much about, and this young upstart who was known to be a little mischievous. And we went into his town and stole his belt, and it was a really special moment that I'll never forget. I think one of the other moments that stands out to me, well, two of them, maybe in a way you wouldn't expect, was the first Hearns-Leonard fight. I've never really wagered on a fight before, but I was so sure that Tommy was going to win that fight that I made a very large wager. And going into the 12th round, he was ahead, and I was already halfway in my mind thinking all the things I was going to buy with my winnings. And then the 13th round, everything turned around. Had it been a 12-round fight like we have today, he would have won, but it was 15 rounds at that time, and he didn't win. But that was very memorable to me because I learned, don't ever wager on a fight because one punch can change everything. And I think the second most memorable thing, event-wise, was the Hearns-Hagler fight, because even though Tommy didn't win, it was 3 exciting rounds that people still consider 3 of the most exciting rounds in boxing. And watching Tommy deal with that defeat was psychologically very interesting to me because he took it very hard, didn't leave his house for quite a while. He was so embarrassed and so ashamed. And I use that as a lesson to all the fighters I've worked with since then, to be gracious in defeat and not to be gloating in victory. Be humble at all times and accept the wins and the losses with the same attitude. You win some and you lose some. And I think that's been a great lesson.
Thank you, Jackie, for your time. The First Lady of Boxing. And, we really enjoyed the interview. Thank you for your output and all the best in the future with your fighter as well.
Thank you. I just want to say it was a pleasure. You asked good questions. And when you're with a good interviewer, the time just goes by. So it was a lot of fun. Thank you, Peter.
No, you take care, Jackie, and we'll talk soon.
Alrighty, bye.
Bye-bye.